record, and it's all yours.
Great stuff. Thank you very much. Well, lovely to be talking to you all. This is called Managing Hedges for Pollinators. And yes, hopefully you'll learn some new stuff about hedges and new stuff about pollinators. And really, the other thing I just want to try and convey is just to try and get you to look at the landscape, look at the countryside in a slightly different fashion, because when you're an entomologist and particularly a pollinator researcher, you think about the countryside in different ways. You think much harder about seasonality, about the individual components, about combinations, juxtapositions, mosaics of features, and not just within an ownership boundary, but at a landscape level. And that's fun. It's just fun to think about the landscape through the eyes of a pollinators in a different kind of way, in a more dynamic way. And I'm not talking about anything particularly academic. It's just about looking harder, thinking harder about the things you take for granted, which is really exciting. So I hope you enjoy it. Right. So first of all, a little bit about me. So I'm a pollinator expert. I started as a child sort of naturalist entomologist in North London. I've worked for a range of organisations, the old Nature Conservancy Council, which is kind of Natural England now. I've worked for 2 local authorities, Coventry and Warwickshire. So I was Coventry's first local government ecologist. I've written various books. I worked for Buglife for a while. I worked for the Wildlife Trust for a few months, but now I'm a freelancer. I've got to say, and yeah, I've written books and guidance sheets, but when I'm out in the field, I still quite often revert to that sort of 12, 13-year-old kid in North London, and yeah, I love it. I still have that sort of, and I still do it as a hobby, entomology and whatnot. So yeah, that's kind of what drives me really. But I seem to have done an awful lot with my life publishing, and it's only a fraction of what I want to do, but I do the best I can. Okay, so let's just define what a pollinator is. So in Britain, it's an insect, but abroad it could be a bat, a bird, a possum, as well as an insect, but it's an organism that regularly transfers pollen between the flowers of the same species. That brings about fertilization, which is what we call pollination, and that's crucial for seed and fruit formation, which is important both for ecosystems and also for people. So bees and hoverflies are the best known pollinators, but they only represent a tiny proportion of the flower visiting insects in Britain. And we reckon, well, there's about 6,000 species of flower visiting insects in Britain. It's strange, when DEFRA produced the England National Pollinator Strategy in 2015, it proclaimed there are 1,500 pollinators in Britain. And the minute I looked at it, I thought, that's not right, because I can think instantly of 1,500 flies alone that visit flowers. And then you've got all the Lepidoptera, all the Coleoptera, and all the other groups, the Hymenoptera, the bees, wasps, and sawflies. And eventually I worked out it's much nearer to 6,000 species, and I'm still discovering new ones as I talk to other experts and such like. So yeah, so there's all sorts of insects that visit flowers in Britain, and yeah. So yeah, so we've got 24,000 of species of insects on the UK list. As I say, 6,000 of those visit flowers, and that includes 2,000 sorts of wasp and sawfly, 270 sorts of bee, 1,500 sorts of fly, 1,500 sorts of butterfly and moth, 250 sorts of beetle. And there's a pie diagram there with different colours. The blue is the Diptera, which is the flies. The sort of pale turquoise is the beetles, the Coleoptera. The yellow is the Lepidoptera, which is your butterflies and your moths. And the biggest chunk is the Hymenoptera, that's the group that contains bees and wasps and sawflies. And believe it or not, bees are a tiny bit of that chunk of the pie, because most of that is taken up with that. If you look at the insect below on the right, that's an ichneumon wasp. So these are parasitic wasps. You see a lot of them on flowers. There's about 2,000, maybe 3,000 species. No, it's about 2,000 species that visit flowers. And they're not very good pollinators, but they pick up a bit of pollen. And in terms of species, they are a huge number of flower visiting species. It's also worth pointing out the second from the left there, a figwort flower with a male social, in fact, it's a male tree wasp visiting it. And if you've got a bit of figwort near you in a bit of woodland or a ditch, have a look at what visits the flowers in midsummer, and you'll notice it's not really much. The odd hoverfly, the odd bumblebee, but often the most abundant pollinator on figwort is social wasps. And I think the message there is that certain flowers, they don't want necessarily bees or hoverflies. They actually want other sorts of insects. So it's really important that we recognize there are these 6,000 species of flower visiting insects in Britain, because some flowers, they don't want the bees, they don't want the hoverflies, they want a wasp or a particular sawfly or a particular fly. And if we want to conserve that biodiversity, we need to understand that. That's why it's not me being pedantic when I say, you know, 1500 is wrong. It has real practical implications for knowing there are more than 1500 species of pollinator in Britain, and it helps us with land use decisions. So, but certainly bees and hoverflies tend to be the most effective pollinators. They pick up a lot of pollen on their body. In the case of bees, when bees fly around, they develop an electrostatic charge in their body, which means the pollen actually sticks to their hairs, and then they use their legs to move it onto their pollen baskets. But yeah, so with bees, they actually the pollen is designed to stick to them. And bees and hoverflies, they move very actively around the landscape, and so they're very good at actually moving the pollen around. It's not just a case of picking it up or visiting a flower. You've got to physically move that pollen to actually do the pollination. Yeah, and it's worth stressing the UK honeybee stock only pollinates about 1/3 of our crops. Wild pollinators do the rest, and for free. And this is interesting because yesterday I ended up in a tweet conversation with a Chinese pollinator expert. He was bemoaning the fact that he gets very little on his pussy willow blossom and his willow blossom. Initially I thought, oh, that's strange. Maybe it's because there are different species involved, because we get loads of pollinators on our pussy willow blossom. You only have to go to a local wood or a local hedge to see the number of bees and hoverflies and such like on pussy willow blossom. But then it occurred to me that in China, and I've done an awful lot of traveling in China, you don't really see much woodland or natural grassland or natural wetlands in lowland China. It's got a very low coverage of proper habitat. And so probably what he was seeing is just a lack of pollinators. It's not the fact they don't like willow blossom, they just aren't, there isn't the habitat to generate the pollinators. And really what in Britain, we want to avoid a situation where we don't have the habitat to support the life cycle of the pollinators, and that we literally have to get to a stage where we have to physically move beehives around the countryside to pollinate, you know, our orchards and our crops. That's something we're desperate to avoid, and that's why this talk and the role of hedges is so important, because we want to avoid the mistakes we see in other parts of the world where they've really basically knackered the landscape for pollinators, and so all their fruit trees, all their crops have to be artificially pollinated. Right. So I wanted to mention just a little bit about pollinator decline, because if we understand declines of pollinators, we start to know what to reverse, what to fix. Just concentrating on bees, we've lost 23 bee species in the last couple of hundred years that we've been recording them in Britain. We've got another 5 or 6 bees that are critically endangered. Half of our 27 bumblebees have declined substantially. In fact, a couple have gone extinct. And bees exhibit some really bad declines. And there's a map there, and that map is the map that belongs to the bee below it. The bee below it is the great yellow bumblebee, an absolutely gorgeous bee. It used to occur in Warwickshire. If you go to the Herbert Art Gallery and Museum, you'll find specimens from Brandon, 1922. You can see from the dots there, most of the dots on that map are hollow, meaning that's where it used to occur, but no longer occurs. And you can see it was a very widespread bumblebee, really, an integral part of the old landscape of Britain, medieval landscape. It's now retreated to the very northern fringes of Britain. Really sad. The one in the middle, the short-haired bumblebee, also was at Brandon in 1922. Specimens in the Herbert Art Gallery Museum. That retreated the opposite direction. It retreated south. It was also very widespread. Ended up at Dungeness, and everyone thought, oh, it will be fine at Dungeness. Biggest shingle system in Western Europe, National Nature Reserve. It wasn't. It went extinct about 20 years ago. We now know that actually it wasn't so much associated with Dungeness, although you could find it at Dungeness. It was more associated with Romsey Marsh, which is the coastal grazing marsh around and above Dungeness. And of course, that got affected by agricultural intensification, and the bee declined from there. And that's when you stop seeing it at Dungeness, when it disappeared from Romney Marsh. The saddest story is the bee on the left. That bee, and it's got a label, Bombus lapidarius. That's a misidentification. It's not Bombus lapidarius, which is our common red-tailed bumblebee that you're probably all familiar with. It's actually Couleman's bumblebee. And what the reason it's sad is it was described new to science by a vicar in Ipswich from Suffolk. You know, the type specimen was from Suffolk, near Ipswich, and initially people couldn't separate it from the red-tailed bumblebee. And eventually, only about 100 years ago, people started to recognize it was different, and they started to look in collections, and we started to realize it had a very specific habitat requirement, because if you looked at the old dots and you worked out where it used to occur, it was associated with a habitat called sheep walks. Sheep walks with extensive tracks of chalk grassland that used to go across the North Downs and the Chilterns and bits of southern East Anglia, you know, where places that are, I'm trying to think, some of the commons, Roydon Common, right through to the coast, and that, of course, that's all gone now, because the parliamentary enclosure acts of the last couple of 100 years broke up the chalk grasslands, and then with the different waves of the agricultural revolutions, we started to plough up the chalk grasslands, turn it into arable, and that wonderful bee hasn't been seen in Britain for about 70 years, and they can't even find it in Western Europe anymore. So it's a really sad story of a British bee that's no longer British and barely even European. So there you go. So those are some of the declines of bumblebees. And the causes of those declines is we've got to understand these things. Habitat loss and fragmentation, as I just alluded to, because many bees, many insects, they need extensive joined up habitats. And of course, we've lost that, you know, well, no, playing fields have increased, developed habitats have got more joined up, but the actual semi-natural habitats have become fragmented and reduced in extent. And you don't get those wonderful extensive tracks, and you don't get the combinations of habitats you would have got in medieval times. Then there's habitat deterioration. That can include succession, which is where you let scrub and woodland take over grassland, or rank grassland take over flower-rich grassland. Neglect, which often results in that succession. Poor management, which might mean sort of poorly timed cutting of habitats and grassland. The impact of pollution, you know, basically anything that fertilizes the soil, because for wildflowers and for many insects, they want infertile soils. And really Britain, you think of lowland Britain now, it's really a big carpet of very fertile topsoils because of the you know, the stuff we put onto the soils, you know, the fertilizers. Which is why often quarries and gravel pits and brownfield sites are so good, because they haven't got that carpet of fertile topsoil, and they're often much more flowery and much more diverse. And then things like aerial nitrogen dioxide, which affect places like the Pennines and the Peak District, and also places like the Low Country, very, very well studied in the Low Country, where you get a lot of this polluted rain. It's like a mild fertilizer, and it changes the soil chemistry, which means that species-rich grassland becomes fertilized and turns into rank coarse grassland, and you lose some of the special flowers, and then you lose the butterflies and the other insects and the floweriness of that grassland. So this is a big problem. Then we've got the agri-chemicals, particularly neonics. Those are the ones that get into the press the most. People, you know, very polarizing, because you got the farming sector saying, well, we need them to farm, you know, we can't cope without them. Although some farmers will disagree with that. And then you've got you know, people like Bug Life and Dave Goulson at Sussex University saying, you know, do you know how dangerous these things are? They're worse than DDT. They're really persistent. You know, you put them on a crop, but the pesticide ends up in the pollen and the nectar of a hedgerow. You know, it's and it lasts for years. So that's a very very sort of one of these really polarizing debates within British environmentalism. But it's not just neonics, because fertilizers and herbicides can also be damaging. You know, if you fertilize the soil, you lose some of the special flowers. And there was a big debate on Twitter this week. I'm sure it was beyond Twitter, but it was about some of the with things like Roundup and glyphosate. They reckon it's not so much the active chemical that causes the problems for pollinators. It's some of the agents you put in with it that can be very damaging to pollinators. There was a big debate that Matt Shardlow was leading on Twitter. I guess it was based on a paper that's just come out showing it's the agents that you put in with herbicides and pesticides and fungicides that can do a lot of the damage. Then there's disease, and that bee in the middle. Right, well, we're talking in April, so a lot of you will be seeing great big fat queen bumblebees flying around your garden or your local farmland or your local patch. And the really big fat ones are Bombus terrestris. Now in Britain, it's got a buff-tail. We call it the buff-tailed bumblebee. It's not the buff-tailed bumblebee abroad. It hasn't got a name, as far as I know, but it's the same species. And that one in the middle, which was a photograph in Jersey, is the continental form of Bombus terrestris with a white tail. Looks very much like a giant version of the white-tailed bumblebee we get in Warwickshire. But the point is that they breed up bumblebees in vast quantities commercially in Eastern Europe and other parts of Europe. And they then transport these bumblebees to other places to improve crop pollination, particularly in greenhouses in Britain, but also in places like Japan and South America. They actually let them loose. And the trouble is, not only are you introducing a new type of bumblebee, or in Britain's case, a new subspecies of bumblebee into a place where they're not naturally supposed to occur, but you also transport all the diseases. And bumblebees carry lots of diseases: nematodes, protozoans, viruses. And the situation that's taken place in South America, it's a little bit like when the conquistadors arrived with their smallpox and other diseases. They met populations that were naive to those diseases, that had no resistance to those diseases, and got really decimated by those diseases. And that's what's happening in places now with people introducing non-indigenous bumblebees. It's really serious. So yeah. And also things like honeybee. Honeybee carries something called deformed wing virus, and we know that bumblebees can catch that, and so you sometimes find bumblebees with no wings because of deformed wing virus that they caught off honeybee. So diseases, and we know this from trees and other things, that and animals, that the global movement of crops and diseases and trees and bees, it spreads diseases around. That's the downside of it. Then we got all the climatic factors: the cold springs like this one, wet summers, mild winters, bad summer droughts, which are really damaging, and then finally light pollution, which can affect moths and such like. So there's a lot of pressures on pollinators, as you can see. But we've also got increasing pollinators. I mean, I wrote a bee field guide in 2015, and since then we've added 12 species to the British list, which is almost unprecedented. And some of those are species that were already here, and we use DNA to discriminate them. So they're already here, but we just use DNA to show that what we thought was one species was two. But in the majority of cases, it is brand new colonists. So basically, Europe is getting warmer and drier and more drought struck, and species are desperately trying to find their climatic optimum, which is now moving north as it gets warmer and drier and hotter. Their climatic optimum is moving north, it's moving into Britain, and the ones that can fly across are flying across. And so we're getting lots of new insects arriving in Britain. So it's very exciting, because obviously, you see something new and you publish a paper and maybe it gets in the press, some new bee. But there's also a slightly more worrying story, which is of climate change. And a recent study by CEH, by Gary Powney, it looked very hard at the available data, and the data suggests that we're actually losing pollinators more rapidly than we're gaining them. But the point is, you notice something that's arrived. If I see a new British bee, it's very exciting. I notice it. If I add something to the Warwickshire checklist, I get very excited. But I was looking at something called the gypsy cuckoo bumblebee. I was looking at data for that, and I thought, I haven't seen that in 20 years. I just don't think it's in Warwickshire anymore. It was here 25 years ago. I used to find it, quite widely. It's gone. I think of various hoverflies, but I just haven't seen in Warwickshire, since the 1990s. So it would appear that, we're losing things more rapidly than we're gaining them. And for things that are northern biased, for things that perhaps need cooler, more humid climates, what do they do when things get too hot for them? I mean, we've got the most unprecedented spring this year, where Glasgow and Aberdeen, the season is further ahead than Warwickshire. Their pussy willow came out before our local pussy willow. Their mining bees were active before our local mining bees. It's what I call a phenology inversion, where basically the north, which is normally 3 or 4 weeks behind Warwickshire, is actually ahead of Warwickshire this year because of all the hot sunny days they've had. And that is really, it's a very mixed up climate at the moment. And of course that puts extra pressures on pollinators. Okay. So one of the reasons I do these talks, and one of the reasons that there's so much pollinator activity going on with organizations, is DEFRA launched an England national pollinator strategy in 2014, a strategy to protect pollinating insects which support our food production and the diversity of our environment. So it's double pronged. It's both about natural ecosystems and it's also about food production and what we call ecosystem services. And it's a call to arms, a challenge to record and monitor bees. Do you know what? Two of my slides have just gone missing on the importance. Let's just check. Oh, that's very strange. Two of my slides have just gone missing. But what I will point out at this stage is that about a third of all the food that ends up on your table is due to a pollinator. Pollinators are worth about what is it, £6 billion to the British economy, and only about a third of our food production is done by honeybees. The rest is done by wild pollinators. Why those slides have disappeared, I don't know, but sorry about that. But I just spotted they'd gone. And yeah, and this is one of the reasons why we've got an England national pollinator strategy. There's a big emphasis on citizen science with this strategy, and that's great because Britain is really good at citizen science, getting people to help record pollinators. And as well as the England one, there's a Wales, Scotland and Ireland pollinator strategy. The Ireland one is really good. I'm just going to check to see why my slides went. No, I did literally lose two of my slides. I'm going to have to fix that later. It's not a game changer. Sorry about that. Right. Okay. There we go. So now what I'm going to do very quickly before I get onto the subject of hedges, just quickly review different sorts of pollinator groups in Britain. Now I could fill up a whole slideshows with each of these topics, but I'm going to try and do each one in a few minutes. And of course, because this is a YouTube, you can go back and check the information again. But if we start with bees, we've got about 270 species in Britain. They vary from like the size of a small ant to really huge. In fact, that bee behind my head above me is the violet carpenter bee, which occasionally colonizes Britain, and it's massive. It's Europe's biggest bee. It's even bigger than a queen bumblebee. Now, about 35 species of our bees are social, and they're social when the females become differentiated into queens and subservient workers. So the queens are the only ones that mate. They can lay fertile eggs, but the workers can lay infertile eggs, and believe it or not, they still hatch. They hatch into male bees. So that's kind of weird. And it's not just the bumblebees and honeybees that are social. And in fact, 6 of our bumblebees aren't even social anyway. They're cuckoos. But some of our little bees, what we think of as solitary bees, are actually social. They actually have queens and workers, but they look pretty much the same, unlike bumblebees, where they look different than honeybees. They look different. So that leaves, we have about 80 British species of bees that are cuckoos on other bees. That means they go into the nest when the female is out foraging. They lay an egg in the nest cell, and then their grubs develop at the expense of the host grub. And in fact, that bee in the middle there, which looks like a wasp, is actually a nomad bee. And we're just about to start the nomad bee season locally, all over Britain. So if you look on a patch of ground and you see lots of little volcano holes, which are the mining bee burrows, and you see these wasp-like insects buzzing around, showing a lot of interest in that ground, those will be nomad bees. They won't be solitary wasps because they don't come out until much later. So those are nomad bees, and those are cuckoos. In terms of where bees nest, about 120 bee species nest in the ground, things like footpaths or earth slopes, that sort of thing. And then about 70 bee species nest aerially above the ground, so it's bee hotels, old walls, perhaps a dead tree trunk or a log pile. Those are aerial nesting bees. So it's interesting to see the mix. So you tend to see the aerial nesting bees in your garden if you put up bee hotels. In terms of where they collect pollen, as I said, when they fly around, they build up an electrostatic charge, which means pollen actually wants to stick to the body, almost like magnetism, and then they have to move it to a particular bit of the body, which in most bees, it's the hind leg. But in some bees, leafcutter bees and mason bees, like the one on the right there, they actually collect the pollen underneath the abdomen. In terms of flowers they visit, most bees visit a variety of flowers. Sometimes they have particular preferences for nectar that different to pollen, but we do get specialist bees. So any of you that follow me on Twitter will realize I put out a tweet recently about the fact we've got 5 species of bee that only collect pollen from pussy willow. Many other bees will visit pussy willow, but they'll use it as part of a bigger sort of range of flowers. But there are 5 bees in Britain that only collect pollen from pussy willow. There are several bees that only collect pollen from scabious flowers, So we get some of these specialists as well. And it's important to know, if you've got a site with a specialist, it's important to know that, which is why having a good list of species is really useful. So that's bees in a nutshell. Now here, this is an interesting slide because this gets you to think about the countryside in this different, slightly more dynamic way, which entomologists often do. And it features the Perkins mining bee. It's not one we get in Warwickshire, but we get similar species with similar stories in Warwickshire. The point is, on the left there, we've got the spring generation, which is more strongly red banded, and it does most of its foraging on blackthorn and pussy willow. On the left, coming out of the nests of the previous generation, you get the summer generation, which kind of flies late summer, and it needs a different foraging habitat, sort of damp meadows with angelica and things like bramble and thistles and such like. Now the point is, if you lose the scrub for the first generation, you lose the whole bee. You don't just lose the first generation, you lose the whole bee. If you lose the wet meadows that are needed by the second generation, you lose the whole bee, not just the summer generation, you lose the whole bee. The bee needs to get through both its generations to survive as a species. And you can start to think of that in a slightly different way. I mean, number one, you can list those requirements, the spring requirements, the summer requirements, the nesting requirements, even the lecking, the courtship requirements, which requires another type of habitat feature. You can put it into an Excel spreadsheet. You can then put all the requirements of all the other bees at your site into an Excel spreadsheet, and you start to see all the requirements of those bees on a patch of landscape, and it makes you a bit dizzy. You think, well, I might as well give up. How the hell do I start to conserve for all these bees? Well, actually, the thing to bear in mind is that nature is always trying to do it for you anyway. And if you allow nature to express itself, it will often do the hard work for you. You stop nature from doing it. If you gang mow grassland, if you clear out all your scrub, if you don't allow nature to express itself properly, then you will lose the species and you can't manage for the species. But if you end up, and I've got Ben there, so I'm thinking of Wright and Pools, Ben. So, Wright and Pools, it's quite a big area of land, and you've allowed bits of scrub encroachment, and you've allowed a sort of flowery grassland to develop. And that's when nature starts to create what you need for those bees. Another way of looking at it, rather than the Excel spreadsheet way, and I love this, and I do this a lot in my job, is go onto Google Satellite View and pretend you're a satellite. Pretend you're a buzzard or a red kite, looking down on the landscape and looking at the tapestry of a patch of land. Not just, I mean, I get paid often to survey specific sites, but think beyond the sites. Remember, these insects are not interested in legal boundaries or administrative boundaries. They don't know a parish boundary. They don't know a county boundary. It means nothing to them. And they often operate at a landscape level for a life cycle. Just put yourself into that Google Satellite View and just look at the landscape. And that's when you'll notice that places like Brandon Marsh and Wright and Pools and Brandon Reach and Piles Coppice and Brandon Wood are part of a massive, complicated habitat mosaic that's missing from many other bits of Warwickshire. And so, yeah, it gets you thinking. It gets you thinking about, what can I do? What can I do to make the Tame Valley more like the Brandon Marsh complex? What can I do to make the Stockton area? What can I do to create those, as John Lawton said, bigger, better joined up? How can I make bits of wildlife habitat bigger, better and joined up within Warwickshire? But it's just that lateral way of looking at things, using Google Earth, Satellite View, and thinking about the different requirements of a pollinator life cycle. It's not rocket science. You don't have to be particularly academic. It's just about thinking harder, looking harder at what's all around you, what you take for granted. And it's fun. It's really fun. It's like an extra dimension to the way you view the countryside. If you were to think of a bumblebee rather than a mining bee, think of one bumblebee nest. At this time of year, all the queens foraging on the spring blossoms. In a few weeks, they'll be foraging on the dandelions and the white dead nettle. Then the workers come out, maybe late May, June. And each week of the year, they're going to move around the landscape as different flowers wax and wane. And again, if you think of it in a Google Satellite View, you can see that one nest of a bumblebee will be using several square kilometers of land for a life cycle. So as landowners, what can we do to make life easier? And it doesn't mean you have to stop farming. It's about how you do your farming. It's not about how you manage suburban green space. It's not about, it's about how you manage suburban green space and your business park green space. What can you do within the land that you control to contribute to that sort of landscape scale habitat mosaic? And Britain is very good at squandering opportunities. This is the saddest thing, really, is that we have many, many opportunities for biodiversity gain in Britain, and we squander it. We get landscape architects in who just want to put lollipop trees on gangbone grassland, or just want to do something very simplistic, maybe a wildflower seed mix, but nothing else. And really, I suppose one of the real messages of this is, you know, obviously we'll come on to hedges in a minute, is what can we do not to squander opportunities? Okay, bees, big subject. There's a book on it. Go and buy that book. Hoverflies, they were my first true love. I started studying hoverflies when I was a young child. I absolutely adore them. Again, about the same number of species as British bees, 280, vary from tiny to quite big. Many are brilliant mimics of wasps and bees. And what I love about them is they're ecologically so diverse. About half of them have larvae that feed on aphids, and often they need very specific aphids on very specific plants. Some of them want herbaceous aphids that are on herbaceous plants. Others are using aphids on trees. Quite a few species only use aphids on conifers, believe it or not. So that's about half of our species. Then we got about another 40 associated with dead wood or tree wounds, and that one in the middle there, that furry bumblebee-like hoverfly, which is actually flying all of Ben. That flies on the edge of your country park, a Cryrina ranunculi, because there's a really good population at Wrighton Wood. But you'll see it wherever there's a bit of an old woodland in Warwickshire. You'll tend to see it on the pussy willow and the blackthorn. Very aggressive. It headbutts all the bumblebees. It's really aggressive. It's got real attitude to it. But that develops in the deadwood, soggy deadwood in the heart of a tree trunk or a decaying root underground. Usually associated with living trees, because mature living trees have a lot of deadwood in them, and that's where it breeds. So that's a saproxylix. It's one of the 40 saproxylix species. We have 40 species developing inside plants, things like thistles or hawkweeds and such like. We've got 40 species developing in shallow water. The things we call droneflies, they have rat-tailed maggots. So in fact, some of our most abundant hoverflies develop in shallow water. You've even got hoverflies that develop in ant nests, social wasp nests and bumblebee nests. The giant hornet hoverfly that some of you may be familiar with, giant hornet mimicking hoverfly that's becoming quite common these days, that develops in social wasp nests. Yeah. In some years when Europe is very hot and a bit drought struck, the hoverflies will fly into Britain from the continent in huge numbers. I don't think we've had one of those years for a while, but some years, you know, you see an abundance of hoverflies all over the place, in urban areas, even in your back garden. And often they come in from the continent in response to a drought further south. In terms of what they forage on, they don't have particularly long tongues, so they can't really cope well with things like clovers and birds with trefoils that bees like. They prefer open flowers, sort of prunus blossom, blackthorn and cherry, willow blossoms, ragworts, brambles, hogweeds, cow parsley. Those sort of more open flowers is what they really like. And on certain flower types and on certain days, they're actually more abundant than bees on flowers. So there you go. That's hoverflies in a nutshell. Okay, books on those as well. Okay, other fly families. I'm primarily a dipterist, even though I'm best known as a bee expert. Actually, my first area of expertise is flies, all fly groups. And there are at least, we've probably got about 60 or 70 families of flies in Britain, and at least 15 other fly families can be really abundant on flowers. That includes bee flies, soldier flies, dung flies, flesh flies, blowflies. Do you know what? There was a study on a rare orchid on the Hebrides, and they found that the commonest pollinator of this rare orchid was dung flies, not bees, not hoverflies. You can look on oilseed rape in the spring, and in a good year when you get lots of St. Mark's fly, and that's St. Mark's fly on the left there, you can get vast quantities of St. Mark's fly on oilseed rape. And even though they're quite lazy insects and they don't move around a lot, they carry a lot of pollen on their bodies. And what I always say is that a poor pollinator can still be very effective when there's a superabundance of it. A superabundance of a poor pollinator adds up to a lot of pollination. So don't write off the poor pollinators, because if they're very abundant, they're still moving a lot of pollen around the landscape. But you've got a blue bottle in the middle there, and that's developing on carrion. The really big sort of tessellated sort of grey and black flesh flies you see sunbathing on footpaths and rocks, they breed in earthworms. So some things are coming out of snails. All these things are generating pollinators on flowers. So it's important to know about these other insects. It's important to know what their life cycles are. It's important to know that dung produces an awful lot of pollinators. If you have mixed agriculture with grazing and arable, you'll get a lot more pollinators on your crops because the dung is producing lots of flower visiting insects. So it's just really interesting to think about all these other insects. That's, you know, when I talk about 6,000 species being, you know, more important than 1,500, it's true, because that, you know, you need to understand what these species are. Okay, in terms of Lepidoptera, which are our butterflies and moths, all of our butterflies, as far as I know, visit flowers, and most, not all, but most of our 2,500 moths are also flower visitors. We're still learning about moth flower visiting because they do a lot of it at night and we can't easily observe it, but we think they're very, very important. Most of them have caterpillar-like larvae. Not all of them. You get things like goat moth and clear wings that have larvae that develop through burrow through wood, and they don't particularly look like caterpillars. But the key thing about them is that often their caterpillars need to develop in very specific conditions. So they may be using quite common plants, but in very specific microclimates. I'll give you a good example. You think of bird's foot trefoil, you know, to the untrained eye, one bit of bird's foot trefoil looks a bit like another bit of bird's foot trefoil. But you may wonder, why is the common blue so much more common than the dingy skipper? And it's because the common blue caterpillars can use bird's foot trefoil in relatively cooler settings, often quite dense grassy settings, whereas the dingy skipper, it needs its bird's foot trefoil in much hotter places. It really needs its bird's foot trefoil in places where the temperature is reaching about 30 degrees centigrade. If you've got bird's foot trefoil growing over bare ground, when the sun shines, the first few inches of air above the ground are very hot. And that's what the caterpillar of the dingy skipper needs. The common blue doesn't need that. It can use much cooler air for development. That's why it's much more common than the dingy skipper, and that's why the dingy skipper is much scarcer than the food plant. I'm sure you know this, Ben. You must have all of this going on in your country park. But if you go into Ryton Butterfly Meadow next door to Ryton Country Park, you'll see that Mike and his guys, his volunteers, they've specifically created bits of rubble and they've planted bird's foot trefoil on rubble specifically for the dingy skipper. And it's also the reason why the dingy skipper does so well in the old quarries, but it doesn't occur in the meadows where you get the common blue. So isn't that interesting? Just thinking again, this is this way of seeing the countryside through the eyes of a pollinator. Also, the other thing to say is that many butterflies and moths are migratory, and they come in here in big numbers when it's very hot in the south of Europe. And the other thing to stress is that butterflies are very good flagships for habitat conditions. So if you get certain blues and skippers in open habitats, you know it's going to be good for all sorts of things, bees and wildflowers. If you get a good range of fritillaries in woodland, and things like purple emperor and white admiral, it tells you that woodland's got good physical structure. It's got open spaces and glades and rides and clearings, and it's going to be good for all sorts of things. So butterflies can be really good flagship species for habitat quality. Okay, I'm not going to linger on wasps, just to say there's a lot of them in terms of species, and they breed in all sorts of habitats, and they are important players. Ditto with beetles. You know, several hundred species that visit flowers. They don't pick up a lot of pollen. They don't move around the landscape as much as bees and hoverflies. But if you have a superabundance of them, they can still be doing a lot of pollination. Okay. So the key messages that come out of this first section of the talk: there are many types of pollinator. They visit many types of flower. Their larvae have life cycles of many sorts. You know, in dead wood, in shallow water, parasitic life cycles. Predatory life cycles, saprophytic, in all sorts of locations. You know, you can look around the countryside. Almost every place you look has got pollinator larvae developing. Most critically, the larvae and the adult requirements are often very different, and you need both. We're very quick to put in the flowers for the adults. We don't tend to think as hard about what the larvae need. But if you don't cater for the larvae, you won't get the adults. Some adult pollinators, particularly bees, have long foraging periods, so you've got to give them everything they need, really from spring to early autumn. And obviously a large and diverse site is better at achieving that, and simplified sites are poorer at doing that. And that's why really big complex habitat mosaics like Brandon Marshall, Wrighton Pools or Sutton Park usually have much richer pollinator assemblages than small simplified sites. But just bear in mind that, you know, if you've got a really good flowery suburb with lots of good gardens and lots of good green space, it effectively acts as a big habitat mosaic. So you have to think quite laterally. You have to think in this Google Earth way about what, you know, what's making a bit of landscape tick. And you know, suburbs can be very, very good for pollinators. Okay. Right, so now I'm going to move towards hedges and to farmland. So this is a bit more relevant to you. So right, so how do pollinators interact with farmland? I can't actually see the top of that slide because I've got a dialog box, so I'm guessing what it says. But typical farmland, it can furnish a range of habitats that benefit pollinators, the flowering crops, oilseed rape, broad bean, borage, flax. You've got the arable field margins and the headlands, the rested fields, the flowery pasture, the flowery hay meadow, the ditches, the pools, the other wetlands, the trees, the woodland, the scrub, the farmyards and the tracks. And then within that, you've got the hedgerows. So the hedgerows sit within a habitat mosaic. Farmland is nearly always a habitat mosaic. It can vary in its simplicity or its complexity, depending how you manage it. And it's worth saying that in a typical bit of farmland, including the bit I live in, Kenilworth, and I'm always walking through the local farmland, you can have several hundred species of pollinator interacting with a single farm, either as adults or larvae, and they can be using all sorts of features within that farmland during their life cycle. So that's interesting, isn't it? Oh, look at that lovely picture, bottom picture. I love that. That's just near me. Some flowering oilseed rape and some white dead nettle. And the white dead nettle is very good for the queen bumblebees and all sorts of things are on the oilseed rape. And then you've got a hedgerow, hawthorn hedge next to it. And then a footpath, a public footpath that has all sorts of weeds growing along it. Lovely. Okay. So why hedges important? Well, hedges, they're a source of blossom and flowers for adult foraging. They act as a place for larval development of various sorts. Something that's not often appreciated by people, hedges are really important windbreaks. And on a rather windy, breezy day, one side, the sunny side of a hedge, which might be the south or the east-facing side of a hedge, can be a lot warmer than the north or the west-siding face of a hedge. And pollinators, they don't like breezy weather. They, you know, their life is a lot easier if they can find sort of still air to fly around and to forage on. You know, they really struggle. They use up a lot of calories using breezy, flying through breezy air. And so hedges are very good at slowing down the wind speed and creating little pockets of warm, still microclimates. And microclimate is so important. Again, it's another way of viewing the landscape through the eyes of a pollinator. Whenever I do surveying, I tend to keep my sleeves rolled up because I want to know where the air temperature rises and where the wind speed drops, because that's where I tend to see a lot more pollinator activity. So that's a really important way of thinking of hedges, and also, you know, tree belts. They act as important windbreaks that can really make a big difference. Conversely, hedges are also an important location for shade and humidity. If you've got a drought summer, everything might burn off on the sunny side of a hedge. You know, it might be 80 degrees centigrade, and the insects don't like it. They might be on the shady side of a hedge because there's more hogweed there, and then the air temperature is a bit cooler. But also in terms of larval developments, you know, the interior of a thick hedge can be quite a cool shady spot. That's very good for, you know, if you've got something developing in dead wood, it might prefer the dead wood or fungi that are growing in the shade, not in the open. And then the other thing to stress again is that your hedges occur as a vital part, a vital component of a larger interacting landscape scale habitat mosaic. So think of your hedges as part of a bigger offer. And something I keep banging on about, and I'll just repeat it again, pollinators are great for viewing habitats such as hedgerows in a new way, drawing your attention to seasonality, microclimates, microhabitats, plus landscape scale combinations and interactions of all these factors. And it ain't rocket science, because you think about your garden. Where do you sunbathe in your garden? You don't, you know, if you know, or on the beach, you sunbathe where it's out of the breeze. You don't want to sunbathe in the breeze. It's cool. You get goose pimples. Pollinators are just the same, you know. And you know, you want your ice cream shop nearby. You want your hotel nearby. You want a car park nearby. Even humans need habitat mosaics. It's the same principles with pollinators. It just doesn't involve ice cream and car parks. But they're equivalent. They're equivalent. I've never put it like that before. I like that. I like that one. Okay. I can't see what the top of that says. Oh, I think it's probably, is it? I think it's probably something about hedgerow blossoms and plants. Yeah, I completely lost the top of my screen there. So hedges might be comprised of just one woody species like hawthorn or blackthorn, in which case you might get a fortnight of blossom, but a more diverse hedge network with mixed woody species produces something called a blossom sequence. And this is something I'm always banging on about because I'm really keen to see farmers boosting their blossom sequences. And a good blossom sequence, in Warwickshire, it might start with common gorse in winter, because on our more acidic soils, we get common gorse in the hedges. This is usually where the hedges were imposed upon former bits of heathland and commons. So not far from me in Kenilworth, places like the old Balsall Common or Hockley Heath, you see gorse in the hedgerows, and it's because we used to get open heathland in those areas. So you can get that in the winter. Then you get the cherry plum, which is the thing that looks like blackthorn. People that were saying, oh, I've got blackthorn blossoming in late February, early March, it wasn't blackthorn, it was cherry plum, but it looks a lot like blackthorn, but it flowers before the blackthorn. We've now got the blackthorn at its peak, and you get the goat willow and the grey willow. And then between the blackthorn and the hawthorn, you often get wild crabapple and field maple and wild pear. Then after the hawthorn, which is usually in May, after that you get guelder rose, elder, dogwood that can go into June. So there you go. That is a 3-month blossom sequence. A lot better than just having a hawthorn sequence on its own or a blackthorn sequence on its own. This is why it's always great to have to boost your blossom sequence and to add things to your hedges. As well as your hedge shrubs, you can have hedge trees. They may be blossoming species like wild cherry, crack willow, pear sycamore, orchard apple, horse chestnut. And also the components of a hedge that are allowed to grow out. You can get goat willow and crabapple actually within the body of the hedge, or you can allow it, or field maple, you can actually allow it to grow into a hedge tree. So anyway, there below we've got a nice picture of a blossom sequence. We've got some blackthorn on the left, we've got some hawthorn, which will be out in a few weeks' time, in the middle, and we've got some horse chestnut. That's right next to Ufton Fields actually, and that will be again in May, usually the same time. Oh, with the cow parsley on it as well. That's a bit of a hedge blossom sequence. Okay, so these blossoms, they can attract vast numbers of pollinators, including butterflies. Many of the butterflies on the spring blossoms are things that have hibernated as adults. They were actually foraging on the ivy in the autumn, went into hibernation, and then came out again in spring. Things like the brimstones and the peacock and the small tortoise shells and the commas. You get the queen bumblebees, you get mining bees of various sorts, hoverflies, all sorts of other squitty flies that have come out of dung or carrion, and longhorn beetles. So these are the things you see on spring blossoms. Particularly if you find a bit of blossom in sunny sheltered areas and you look at it, just spend a few minutes looking at it and you can start to see all the variety of pollinators that visit it. Okay, now the thing to stress is you don't have to make every one of your hedges super species diverse with different blossoming shrubs. Think of it as at a field level. It doesn't matter if one hedge is mostly hawthorn, but have you got another hedge that's mostly blackthorn? Have you got a bit of wild pear in your farm? Have you got a bit of cherry plum? Have you got a bit of crab? In fact, there's that nice picture there, which is oh, I'm trying to think where that's Fallbrook. That's a nice hedge near Fallbrook. I think it's Fallbrook, and if you look at it, it's got blackthorn, it's got wild pear. I think it's got hawthorn that hasn't quite started. That is actually quite a species rich hedge, but you don't necessarily need that in every hedge. It could be that the farm unit as a whole has a good variety of blossoming shrubs, and it may be that you want to introduce cherry plum rather than into the body of your hedge. You might have a farmyard or a farm lane, and you put it along the side of that. There are no strict rules, but there is a sort of rule of thumb, and this is any of you that know Zoe, who's involved in the Arden Parklands project, we came up with this good rule of thumb. What blossoms can I see in a given week of spring from a series of vantage points? So really, spring's a really good time for you to assess, right, what blossoming shrubs have I got on my farm or my land? Where are the gaps? How can I fill in those gaps? What can I see this year? What can I do to make things better in future years? So if you've got a few key vantage points and you can see some blossoming shrubs, what can I do to make it better in future years? And again, it's not rocket science. It's not even that expensive. It's really easy to take. You can take cutting. You can strike your own cuttings if you want. You don't have to buy them. You can actually take cuttings of your own things and just spread them around a bit. So I really do urge you to try and boost your blossom sequences in your hedges. Okay, and there you go. There's some nice pictures of things on blossoms. Yeah, something to stress here. It's one of the reasons I've got this picture. You'll be aware that we're getting late Februaries that are ridiculously warm. We're getting late Februaries where it gets up to 18, 19, 20. Well, this year it even got up to 25 degrees centigrade at Kew Gardens. This is becoming a regular feature of the British late winter, these really hot days. And the problem is it causes pollinators to emerge too early. And of course, in a typical bit of farmland, there's nothing for them to forage on. So of course they die, they use up calories, they die. They can get to an urban area, they might be able to forage on something in gardens. But one of the things I'm really urging farmers and landowners to do is specifically to plant cherry plum. There's cherry plum on the left there. Cherry plum, Prunus ceracifera. It looks like blackthorn. It's not blackthorn. It doesn't have that many spines. It tends to have green twigs. You're probably also very used to seeing the pink flowering form with the purple leaves. You often get in urban areas called purple leaf plum. It's the same species, but really what you want is the shrubby white flowered form that looks like blackthorn. And really, if every farm could try and introduce a bit of that into the hedges or around farmsteads, it would make a big difference. It means that if we get these really hot Februaries or these or very hot early Marches before the blackthorn has come out, the insects have got something to forage on a few weeks earlier. You know, I can't stress how important that is. Also, more goat willow. Goat willow can be grown within a hedge, but it also makes quite a good hedgerow tree. Or you can have it around a farmstead, or if you've got a pond, put a little bit of goat willow around the edge of a pond or a wetland. But those two are really good because they give a lot of pollen and nectar before the blackthorn gets going. So I really do stress. So Ben, have you got much of that? Good. Thumbs up.
Loads.
I'm gonna go and check it, Ben. I'm gonna come and check it sometime. Yeah. Give you a mark out of 10. Okay. In terms of flowers, hedge banks and hedge margins can also be a rich source of flowers, from things like lesser celandine violets, white dead nettle, cowpath in spring, through to the willow herbs, the woundworts, the thistles, the hogweed, the teasel, the knapweeds, the ragworts in summer. And it's worth saying, I can't remember if I've got a slide for this, but we're very lucky in Warwickshire. I don't know if you're all aware that we're half planned countryside and half ancient countryside. We're one of the few counties that has a kind of 50-50 split. And so the hedges, if I'm in Kenilworth, if I go towards Ulster or I go towards Birmingham, the hedges there are a high proportion of medieval hedges. They're on hedge banks. They have lots of ancient woodland plants growing along the banks, and they're very, very old and very species rich. Whereas if I go towards Southam or Banbury, I'm into planned countryside with much younger hedges that aren't as species rich. They're not in hedge banks, and they have different flora. So it's just worth stressing that as this is a Warwickshire talk. But yeah, certainly the hedge banks, the hedge margins can be very full of all sorts of flowers that are very important for pollinators. Okay, and there's some good examples there. So things like dead nettle, very good, very important for queen bumblebees. Okay, and as I say, the local geology can influence the flowers. So if you're on a lime-rich soils, your hedges may have things like hoary ragwort, field scabious, great knapweed, wild privet, wild parsnip, traveller's joy. If you've got acid soils, you tend to get things like wood sage, gorse, foxglove, greater stitchwort, those sorts of things. And as, oh yes, I've mentioned it here, the old hedge banks of ancient countryside, which is what we call our Arden, you get the woodland indicator species such as your native bluebell, your primrose, your wood anemone. So if you haven't picked up on that, it's one of the things that brings Warwickshire to life, knowing about this 50-50 split of two completely different landscape evolutions related to the Enclosure Acts and just the way we cleared the forest. And it's all linked to geology, because basically people wanted to clear farmland on the better geology, which is the limestone of the east and south, as soon as they could, but they needed much more modern farming practices like the use of fertilizer, deep plows, to bring the Arden into good farming land, because it was much poorer soils on sandstones and gravels. So, and obviously the pollinators are really strongly influenced by these factors. Okay, hedge scramblers and hedge climbers so things like brambles, wild roses, white bryony, black bryony, traveller's joy, honeysuckle, woody nightshade, bindweeds, and ivy. Bramble and ivy can be really important. I mean, bramble is just fantastic. And I don't know if you're aware that bramble, we talk about it as if it's one species. Actually, bramble is a collection of what they call apomictic species. You know, there are dozens and dozens of different species in Warwickshire. And often you'll get a mix of species within one patch of land. And you may get different flowering peaks associated with the different bramble species. So when one thing's going over, another bramble might be taking over. But certainly in a typical Warwickshire hedgerow, you might get a peak. You might start in May, you might get a June peak, but you can often persist right into late summer as a flowering scrambler. And then in ivy, the ivy from September into October, the ivy blossoms, and it can attract vast numbers of pollinators, particularly if it's somewhere nice and sheltered. And a lot of those are things that are going to go into hibernation and come out the next spring. So these are really good things to encourage. But you do often see bramble, you often see bramble being cleared from a hedge margin and ivy being taken off tree trunks and such like. Sometimes you have to do it, but you don't have to eradicate. It's the same thing with thistles and ragwort. Thistles are covered by the Injurious Weeds Act, ragwort is covered by the Ragwort Act. Those acts don't tell you to eradicate them, they tell you to control them. And it's worth saying that creeping thistle, common ragwort, really, really important flowers for pollinators. So if you can learn to live with them and tolerate them within controlled limits, please do. It's one of the best things you can do for pollinators. Okay. I can't read what that says there. I can't read what the top says there. It looks like I'm talking about microclimates. Yeah, pollinators hate breezy weather, as I said before. Farmland can be quite exposed, quite a windy environment. A thick hedge can act as a great windbreak. And think of the wind direction. So your prevailing wind is that from the southwest. And also bear in mind that pollinators like to do most of their foraging sort of late morning, early afternoon. So the south facing and the east facing bit of a hedge is very valuable, actually more valuable than west facing or north facing, because the north facing gets the it doesn't get so much of the sun. The west facing hedge often gets the prevailing wind, so it's breezier. So it's another interesting way to think about the configuration of farmland, and in particular the sort of northwest corner of a field. When you've got prevailing wind and morning sunshine, it can be really good for pollinators. And I only have to walk around my Kenilworth farmland, and I know if I've got some blackthorn or some hawthorn in the northwest corner of a field in the morning, that's where most of the pollinator activity is going to be. And if you've got oilseed rape there, that corner of the field is where you're going to see a lot more pollinators on that corner of the field than in the breezier bits of the field. So if you're not used to thinking in these terms, it's a good way of thinking, and it's no different to you sunbathing on a beach on a breezy day. You don't want your deck chair in the breeze. It's not always very nice. So it's what we call microclimate, warm, windless microclimate. Okay. Right. As I say, if you get a drought year and a heat wave year, then suddenly your shaded bits may become important. And that hoverfly there that I show on the right, I chose that hoverfly particularly because it tends to fly in late summer, and it's a shade-loving hoverfly. You often find it on angelica and hogweed, but on the shady side of the hedge. And if you get a big drought and a big heat wave, and it's 80 degrees centigrade and very hot, you'll find that a lot of your pollinator activity is actually in the shade. It has to shift. I mean, I've done a lot of collecting in the Mediterranean, places like Israel and Crete, and you do get some of the same hoverfly species as you get in Britain, but you have to go out between 7 a.m. and 10 a.m. in the morning to record them, because come sort of 10:30, it's so hot, a lot of the pollinators go to ground. So pollinators, they actually adapt their activity according to the temperature and the weather. And when it's very, very hot, they either go to ground or they find somewhere shady to do their foraging. So isn't that interesting? It just gets you thinking about these things in a slightly different way. Again, I can't see the top here. Right, a tendency only to consider the adult needs of pollinators. Yeah, so again, you've got to think about what do the larvae need. It's not just about what the adults need, what do the larvae need? And as I said before, pollinator life cycles very varied, include larvae developing in all sorts of places, foliage feeders, predators, parasitoids, things developing in dead wood, gall formers, blah, 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 loads and loads. And it's just thinking about the components of a hedge that are important for life cycles. So, right, what have I got here? So We got Hedge. It's actually near Willoughby. It's or Granborough. That hedge on the east. Oh, sorry, on the left there. It's got a really good hedge ditch. Can you see? It's got willow herb. I bet it's got some meadow sweet. It's got some phalaris, reed canary grass. That's a really nice wet ditch growing up next to a hedge in East Warwickshire. And that, you know, you've got lots of things developing in that wet hedge, and then also foraging on the meadow sweet. And you know, if you've got yellow flag and willow herb, there'll be all sorts of things foraging on the flowers there. On the right, we've got a hedge. I think it's a slide I used before, but it's got horse chestnut blossoming, got cow parsley, it's got a hawthorn hedge that's about to flower. It may have all sorts of scramblers in it. That's quite near to Ufton Field. So yeah, just bear in mind all the development sites. And this is why a floristically diverse and a structurally diverse hedge is so important. You know, a hedge that's a bit thicker, got a few more species growing in it, got a decent margin. These become much better hedges for pollinators and wildlife generally. Okay, and I showed you a wet hedge ditch. Look at some of those wonderful insects come out of wet hedge ditches. Got a drone fly on the top left, soldier fly on the top right, another sort of drone fly, the tiger hoverfly on the bottom left, another type of hoverfly. These all come out of wet mud and shallow water. They all visit flowers. Okay, if you've got a hedge on a bank, you often get the sort of bare earth associated with a hedge bank, and you get all sorts of mining bees nesting in these hedge banks. You can get up to a dozen species of mining bee nesting in one hedge bank. It's quite amazing, including beautiful things like the ashy mining bee and the tawny mining bee and Clark's mining bee. Wonderful. The Clark's mining bee is one of those ones that only forages on pussy willow, but it needs something like a hedge bank to nest in. And it's got to be a sunny hedge bank. It's got to be one that gets warm and sunny. Okay, and in turn, those mining bees support another group of pollinators: the cuckoos, the parasites, the parasitoids. So we've got a nomad bee on the left there. We've got a bee fly on the top. I'm sure you're all used to seeing bee flies. And if you look really carefully at blossom, you'll often find what are called bee grabbers. These are little flies that they jump on a mining bee and they inject an egg in the abdomen. But they're pollinators as well as being parasites. These are all pollinators in their own rights. So you create one decent hedge bank, you get the bees, you get the parasites and whatever, and you have a whole suite of pollinators. So just to stress, pollinators can have very complex life cycles that often require several independent features, such as larval development sites, a long progression of different flowers, overwintering sites, maybe even lekking sites where the courtship and the mating takes place. And your hedgerow sits within this habitat mosaic. That's a lovely picture near Avon Dasset, one of the gorse-clad hillsides. I'm looking towards Edge Hill there, and you've got oilseed rape, you've got some mature hedges, you've got a gorse-clad hillside, and some sheep-grazed grassland that is probably very good for the nesting. And you can see some little burrows of the ashy mining bee on the bottom there. Those slopes are very. If you go to those slopes at exactly this time of year, April, you find a nice slope, a nice sort of slope on the around Burton Dasset Hills or Edge Hill. You'll find lots of these nesting aggregations, often thousands of nests of these mining bees with bee flies and all sorts of other nomad bees, all sorts of things on those hillsides. Okay, so hedges might be all just one, but a crucial requirement of a life cycle. They provide the spring blossom, and then, you know, the queen will be using the spring blossom, but her workers may then go on to pollinate arable crops like beans and such like later in the year. Hedge banks, dead trees can be really important for nesting bees. So your hedges may be really important for boosting, you know, a local orchard might be better pollinated because you've got a good hedgerow nearby. So yeah, the key message: a good hedge network contributes massively to the carrying capacity of a landscape for a diverse assemblages of wild pollinators. Can you see that? Your hedges really do boost capacity of landscape for pollinators. In terms of hedge management, many hedges suffer from being cut every year, and this drastically reduces the amount of blossom they produce. Often reduces their value as windbreaks and as a source of shade and humidity. So I've got two photos there. The one is of a hedge on Rouncil Lane in Kenilworth that gets cut every year. It's not the worst of hedges, but you can see it's got fairly limited blossom. And then there's another lovely hedge near Wootton Rowan, which has been allowed to grow out a little bit, and it's got a lot more blossom. It's thicker, it's got more structural complexity to it. So really, ideally, you want to cut a hedge at least every 3 years. There can be issues because, yeah, sometimes if a hedge isn't in a very good state, if you cut it every 3 years, it ends up looking very threadbare and you can get a bit sparse. But a healthy hedge, a thick hedge, can cope usually with being cut every 3 years. But of course, you don't have to cut all your farmland hedge every 3rd year. Cut a third every year. That's the best way to do it. You don't want to catastrophic change to all your hedges in 1 year. You know, try and do it on a cycle, because diversity and variety is good. Okay, flowering buffer zones, really important. Try not to cut them when they're at their flowering peak. All too often we see hedge margins cut in when the hogweed's out in June, or when the cowpath is out in May, or when the thistles are out in July. If you don't need to do that, try not to do it. But it does happen quite a lot. Yeah. Often hedges get very weak and gappy, and of course you have to put a bit of life into them. You might have to lay them, and I love hedge laying, so I've got nothing against hedge laying, but a few precautionary messages here. Be aware of what woody species are growing in your hedges before you go to lay them. It may be that you have the only little bit of wayfaring tree or the only decent patch of goat willow in the entire farm area. Do you want to lay that, or do you want to leave that standing when you lay your hedge? Do you want to lay around it? Just be aware of what species are in your hedge before you decide to lay it or to cut it, because you may be doing a little bit, you know, you may be eliminating something quite important. So it's just worth saying. But yeah. Also bear in mind, if you have certain rare species, you may have to use bespoke hedge management for these, and possibly the best example is the brown hair streak. So the brown hair streak, we thought it had gone extinct in Warwickshire. Then about 25 years ago, we started to pick up records of it, and often in the most intensive farmland, but using blackthorn hedges. And we were really quite shocked when we saw the sorts of hedges it was using, because it wasn't using high quality hedges. It was often using quite thin, weak hedges, but ones that weren't cut every year. And yeah, it's really amazing to find what hedges brown hair streaks are using. But it's quite a rare butterfly, and it's one that does need real bespoke management. So basically, it lays its eggs on the hedgerow twigs, and its caterpillars are feeding. It can't use 1st year growth. It will only do its egg laying on 2nd year growth. So if you have a blackthorn hedge and you cut it every year, you're not going to get brown hair streak. You really do need hedges where you allow them to grow out a little bit and don't get cut every year. So obviously, yeah, it's a really good indicator species, a really good flagship species for long-term cycle hedgerow management. So that's your brown hair streak. If you go into Northamptonshire, you pick up the black hair streak. It also uses blackthorn, but it actually needs much thicker hedges, or even the blackthorn scrub. But again, for both of those species, annual cutting can be disastrous, or it is disastrous, no question about it. So I can't see the top of that. It looks like summary of something pollinator. So right, I think it's a summary. So 1, structurally and floristic diversity, i.e. reasonably thick and tall hedges with good blossom sequences and plenty of wildflowers are really good. Hedge trees, flowery buffery strips on either side. If appropriate, hedge banks, wet hedge ditches. These are some of the important features of hedges. Try not to cut them manually, but on a rotation of at least 3 years, and not all in one go. Try and do a third each year, or a quarter each year. See if you can augment your hedgerow system with other semi-natural or flowery habitats, such as woods, wetlands, ditches, watercourses, flowery arable margins, flowery crops, uncultivated field corners, gardens. If you've got an old cutting going through your land, or an old quarry or pit, you know, try and bring that into the equation. But just think about your hedgerow as part of a bigger offer, a bigger mosaic, you know, integrated within a much bigger mosaic of habitats. In terms of information, there's quite a lot on land. There's a bug life thing there on farmland. If you go onto Stephen Falk ResearchGate, which is my ResearchGate site, you can find loads and loads of downloadable stuff on pollinators, not just that farmland sheet, but also one on woodland, one on transport corridors, one on urban areas. You can download them. They're on the Bug Life website, but they're a bit harder to find. Bumblebee Conservation Trust have produced some really good things on hedges. Championing the farmed environments, CFE, which is part of NFU, have produced some good stuff. There's even something from Ireland there, how to guide hedgerows for pollinators from the Irish pollinator strategy. For bespoke management, if you've got hedgerows on your farmland, I don't know, George, whether you've got brown hedge streak on your land. You're very close to a brown streak area, hedge streak area, but you can download these things from HedgeLink or such like information specific on how to manage a hedge for brown hair streak, which is really one of our most important hedgerow species in Warwickshire. And I was just going to quickly say, because I know this is mostly hedges, but I know some of you also have grassland. I just really, it's one slide just covering grassland, just to say a few bullet points here. You know the figure of 97% loss of species-rich grassland in Britain over the last 100 years or so. So really, if you've got any old unimproved species-rich grassland, it's really sacrosanct. Try and retain it and enhance it. If you have to use wildflower seed mixes to enhance a bit of grassland, try to do it where it's appropriate. You don't really want to do it on existing old species-rich grassland, because naturalness is a really important factor. And once you put a wildflower seed mix in an old bit of grass, and you're actually reducing its naturalness and you're actually damaging it. So use your wildflower seed mixes appropriately. Use the right seed mixture in the right place. You may want to use green hay rather than wildflower seed mix. And the great thing about green hay or green straw is that you can get it from a known donor site nearby, and you can put it onto a receptor site, which it's the same soil conditions, it's within the same landscape zone, and it's the right seed mix for that site. So, right. In terms of hay crop, some of you may have hay crops. Obviously, if it's a commercial hay crop, you are dictated by the quality of your hay as to when you cut. And so traditionally you cut beginning of July. It's not really great for pollinators though, because it often results in cutting at your flowering peak. So I'm not telling you not to cut your commercial hay crop in July, because it's it's commercial commodity. But can you find a way of keeping flowers in your landscape? Can you leave margins that are still flowery? If you've got a series of fields, can you leave one field to remain flowery into the late summer? Is there a way of doing it? Because quite often what happens in Warwickshire is over several square kilometres, all the hay gets cut in one go, and literally you lose 95% of all your flowers over several square kilometres at a crucial point of the bumblebee and pollinator foraging period. And it's not great news, and it happens all over the place, and it really does, it really hamstrings our pollinator assemblages here. So yeah, grazing can be good, but if you've got a really flowery bit of pasture, can you avoid grazing it in the summer when it's flowery? Can you rest that field for a few months and put your grazing stock elsewhere? Or can you find a level of grazing that still means you've got some flowers coming through? Because obviously grazing is very important as a management tool, but it can wipe out some of the key flowers when they're flowering, when they're doing their flowering peak. Remember the value of what people often call noxious weeds, dandelions. Dandelions are really important in May. You see loads of pollinator activity on dandelions. There's even a dandelion appreciation society, believe it or not, in Britain, and it's all about promoting dandelions and pollinators on them. Thistles and ragwort. If you go to a good patch of creeping thistle in summer, you will see, if it's in if it's in the sun and out of the breeze, the sheer number of pollinators attracted to creeping thistle is phenomenal. Why would you want to eliminate it? The Injurious Weeds Act doesn't tell you to eliminate, it tells you to control. There's a difference between control and eradication. Ditto with ragwort. We do not want ragwort in hay crops. You do not want ragwort in dried hay. We all know that. We all appreciate that. You don't have to pull ragwort from every bit of road verge though, and within pasture. Stock has coexisted with ragwort in grasslands for millennia. Stock, unless it's really poor pasture, most stock will live quite happily alongside ragwort. Also bear in mind that the Ragwort Act only covers common ragwort. If you're on limestone country, you may have hoary ragwort. Hoary ragwort is not covered by the Ragwort Act. It has the same protective legislation as all other wild plants. I've also mentioned yellow rattle there. Yellow rattle is a really valuable plant. If you want to find a really sort of environmentally friendly way of boosting the floweriness of your grassland by suppressing the grasses, you can use yellow rattle, because it's a hemiparasite. It can get chlorophyll, but it has got chlorophyll, so it can use sunlight, but it also takes a lot of its energy from grasses. So a really good way of making your grassland better is to introduce yellow rattle, and then often you get the orchids and the ladies' bed straw and the legumes coming in on the back of the yellow rattle, suppressing the grasses. In terms of what flowers you want to boost in your grassland, legumes can be really good for bees, and a lot of stewardship options tend to put an emphasis on legumes like clovers and vetches. But just bear in mind that legumes aren't much good for hoverflies and other flies. They need things like umbellifers, hogweed, carrot, cow parsley, and composites like knapweed or oxeye daisy or thistles or such like, hawkweeds, hawkbits. Those can be very valuable for the other sorts of insects. So bear in mind that the more diverse your, if you're doing environmental stewardship, the more floristically diverse your margins, the better. And that, it's fine putting down clovers for bumblebees, but it will only serve the bumblebees. It won't serve the other things. Then bear in mind the small scale features, the old ant hills, the damp depressions, the ditches, the pools. These can be very valuable features within grassland. Also, beetle banks. You might have beetle banks that you put into your grassland. And we know that beetle banks are great because you have good beetle banks and actually good field margins. You get a lot of what's called integrated pest management. A lot of farmers have discovered recently that they've stopped using pesticides. For years and years, they had their farm advisors saying, you've got to use pesticides. It's because the big agri companies wanted to buy pesticides. And a lot of farmers have discovered that actually using integrated pest management is just as good as using pesticides, but it means you see a lot more wildlife on your farmland. So it's a bit of a no-brainer, really, isn't it? But it's a very polarizing issue, the whole thing of pesticides. Okay, if you want to identify more of what's on your farmland and in your hedges, here are some of the main books you can buy. It's quite a lot of choice now. Two of those are my books, the bee book and the hoverfly book. I'm either author or co-author, and I can boast that my photos and my images are in 6 of those 8 books, but not in the moth and butterfly ones. But those are great. It's very easy to buy these books. They're all fantastic. So yeah. Also, it's worth saying, even if you do have those books, there's a lot of information online, fantastic information online. And I'm going to do a big plug of my Flickr site. So if you go onto Google or any other search engine, there are other search engines available. If you type in Stephen Falk Flickr collections, the collections bit is vital. Otherwise, you just get to my photo stream, which isn't hierarchical. But if you put in that full set of 4 words, you get to my landing pad, which is basically a massive website of covers all sorts of wildlife groups, even covers cultivated cherries. It's the biggest online, one of the biggest online collections of cultivated cherries, which is another passion. But it also it covers all the British bees. It's the only place where you can find information on all the British bees, because all the books are out of date now. Even my 2015 one, virtually every hoverfly and loads of other insect groups, and just keep clicking away. You can't get viruses. It works best on a PC or a laptop. You can use it on your phone as a sort of app, but it's much harder to navigate. But it's a monstrously big resource, and you just keep clicking away. When you get into a species album, if you click the top, you get a drop-down species account, and usually the species accounts are often very up to date, more up to date than what's in books. So it's really good, and I've got to shamelessly plug it. Those management sheets I was telling you about, yeah, if you go onto Stephen Falk ResearchGate publications, lots of information on pollinators there, far more than I'm just showing on that page, all sorts of stuff, really interesting stuff. And so really just to summarize, just to finish, why is promoting pollinators brilliant? It's good for the environment, it's good for ecosystem services. It can produce more attractive green space, including farmland. It can be linked to education and community cohesion. It makes you look at the countryside in a different, and I think a much more exciting, multi-dimensional way, doesn't it? Just the stuff I've told you about. Hopefully there's been the odd eureka moment. You thought, oh, I've never thought of that. And hopefully you'll go away and you'll always see your patch of countryside in a slightly different way. You'll be thinking about, oh, I'm in ancient countryside. No, I'm in planned countryside. Oh, the wind direction, I'm feeling warmer here, but I'm feeling colder there. All that sort of stuff. So the key message, it's fun and it's inspiring, and it helps you to connect and understand the green space around you. I think I'm going to finish there. Okay, guys, it's all over. Stop share.